So just as a quick question for the audience, feel free to use the reactions in the chat. How many of you guys have heard of nature? If you just give me a couple of thumbs up. Great, a couple of you. And how many of you have ever published a scientific paper before? Okay, a couple more thumbs up. Great, fantastic. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about the differences between writing science for scientists and writing science for the public, and from the perspective of an editor like me. And I guess we'll just jump right into it. So first, let's talk about the questions that we're going to answer today. And those questions are predominantly, what is primary research and what is secondary content, and the differences between these two things, how primary research and secondary conference are the same, how they're different, and some general writing tips that you can use for both. But first, let's talk a little bit about nature. So it's great to hear that a lot of you have heard of my journal. I'm very proud to work there. It's a fantastic place to be. And Nature is a scientific journal that tries to publish the major breakthroughs in a broad range of science. It is an old journal. It's from the 1800s, and some feathers in our cap, some accomplishments that we have published are things like the existence of the neutron, Dolly the sheep, human genomes, carbon nanotubes, the discovery of X-rays, etc. And we really pride ourselves on the work that we publish and trying to highlight the best research that we can in their respective fields. So I've been saying research and papers that we publish, and what this really means is primary research. So what primary research is, it is you reporting your results, your data. So whenever you go into the laboratory and you do research and you get your results and you write up those results into a manuscript or a report, that is primary research. It is you reporting your data. By contrast, secondary content are writings or pieces about research. So it's not reporting the research, it is talking about the research. And these can be things like interpretations, commentaries, a lot of your news articles or popular science news articles and things like Phys.org or etc. are secondary science. And its purpose is slightly different. Secondary content describes, interprets, or synthesizes primary research. A good example of this would be like a review article or a perspective article where you take a historical look at the literature and you compare how the literature has changed or evolved or the major themes throughout the years. So let's compare them really quick. Some things that they have in common is they both can convey your results, their context, and their implications, and they're almost always geared towards an educated audience. And what this means is that whenever we talk about science in these contexts, we're not really teaching children. We're usually talking to people, or we're communicating with people who more or less have at least a bachelor's degree, are the people who are our target audience for this type of content. And the third thing that they have in common is that they both benefit from clear and concise writing. So trying to be as clear, as direct, and using as little words as possible to get the point across. Finally, they also need great motivation. Whether or not you're reporting your results or you're talking about the results that have been reported, we both need to the audience needs to get an understanding of why should we care about these results? What is important about them? Why would somebody take the time to convey these results? And now that we know how they're similar, let's talk a little bit about what they do differently. So this is one of my favorite questions to ask. So you guys are predominantly researchers, as I understand it. And I want to talk a little bit about how we read a primary research paper. These are your research articles that you would find in the literature whenever you're doing your PhD or, doctoral research, etc. And whenever we read a scientific paper, let's just do a quick show of hands. How many of you guys start with the abstract of the paper when you read it? Probably a good bit of you. Good. Nice show of hands. And how many of you, by contrast, once you get through the abstract, just look at the figures and just skip the introduction, etc. You just go straight to the figures. Some of you, right. But whenever we read a newspaper article or something that is like a book, you would never start a book in the middle of the book. You would never start a newspaper article starting with just the pictures. You know, you would read the introduction and go through and through. And for scientists, whenever we are writing for scientists, scientists read research articles very differently. And I think it's a little bit easier to talk about secondary content, this writing about research rather than primary research. So let's start there first, because it more closely mirrors our idea of how to write. And then after that, we'll go into how to write good primary science as well. So for secondary content, this is how to write a science story. I'm sure that from your advisors or throughout your science career, you have probably been told at some point that your science needs to have a good story. That is true with an asterisk, but it's more important for whenever you're writing secondary content, such as reviews or press releases or things about your science. So whenever we talk about this types of secondary content, this is kind of what we're talking about. We're talking what the types of secondary content are things that introduce a concept. They can explain core principles behind something, maybe something like a tutorial, something like a science biography, which would be like a professor writes about themselves and their journey and their life experiences and what they've discovered. It can summarize research, which are the reviews that I talked about previously, and it can give an opinion on research or a topic. For example, I think that this research direction is very promising and more people should do that, or I think this research direction is not promising and we should stop spending federal funding on funding this research. You know, these are good, bad, responsible, necessary, we need more or less of this, etc. And next could be a tutorial. This is how we do something, usually for beginners in the field or first-year PhD students. And then finally, as I mentioned, reviews or perspective articles. So these do not have new data, they simply talk about data that has already been published. And I do have, for any type of writing, but especially primary and secondary research, what I like to call a 5-step program for good science writing. And the first step of this program, rule number 1, is always pick your audience. So just like when writing a scientific paper, your audience is number 1. The main difference here is that you have a lot more freedom in who you are writing for when you create secondary science content. Whenever you write these tutorials, whenever you write these reviews, whenever you write these newspaper articles, your audience might be researchers, which are your audience whenever you do your regular research report, or it could be undergraduate students. Sometimes it could be children. Sometimes you are trying to educate the public, especially if you work in a field that has political implications, such as climate change. And you're going to have to talk to a lot of adult non-experts, and usually with an education level between high school and undergraduate college. And you can also splice these public communities into subgroups such as particularly women, or particularly LGBTQ, or particularly international students from specific countries, etc. And oftentimes you'll pick the age and the education level as also and then also a location such as a local or a global audience. So right now I'm specifically speaking to you guys at your university, but whenever I met Simona in Riga, that was an international conference, so I knew that I'd be talking to researchers from all over the world, and that changes the delivery a little bit. Next on my 2-step program is setting intent. And what this means is, what are you trying to achieve with the writing that you're doing? Are you reporting the news? Or are you sharing an opinion? And in most cases, you will always be sharing an opinion, even when you don't mean to. For example, the way that you write a sentence matters. If I say something along the lines of 10,000 people died, that is very different from me saying 10,000 people were killed, which is also very different from 10,000 people were murdered. Though all of these sentences are technically true, given the context, and could be news, my opinion of the subject in the words that I choose influences the overarching story. And you should keep this in mind whenever you're writing. And the second point that I really want to make about this is that even though we are sharing an opinion, and typically opinions are frowned upon in science, don't be afraid of having an opinion. Whenever you're doing secondary stuff like newspaper articles or interfacing with the public, or if you're at a startup and you need to convince your shareholders, opinions will be most of what you write, and embrace them. Do so purposefully, because you are an expert and people are looking for your opinion, so it's okay to have one. And whenever you choose an opinion and you know that you're giving an opinion, do so purposefully. Because if your opinion is only half developed, or if you don't want to come off as too strong, this hesitance will be visible in your writing, and instead of not coming off too strong, it will come off as weak. And the reader will pick up on this, and your writing won't be as compelling or as moving. The third step in the program is pick a length. You have a lot of freedom in secondary science, and usually this is some type of length between a tweet and a novel. And fourth, assert your message. So this is slightly different from picking an intent, as we've seen before. So in asserting our message, we want our writing to be strong and clear, and we need to answer a couple of questions every time. The first is, what do people need to know? How will it benefit them? What do you want people to know? And once this is done, it's time to build your narrative or your scientific story. So structuring a story, I don't know if anybody has ever seen what we call a narrative diagram, but they kind of look like this, or they can look like this. This is an example of a narrative diagram. And I'm going to quickly go over its parts, because each one of these lines is representative of something. So very simply, stories begin with a setting or an exposition. This is the beginning. This is the background, where you answer the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and any questions set up here will need to be answered throughout the rest of the piece. Something that you'll hear me repeating throughout this talk is that good writing fulfills our expectations. So any questions that we set up in the beginning of our writing, we have to answer thematically throughout the rest of the writing that we're doing. The next piece is the rising action. This introduces the problem and sets the level of urgency. So is this an immediate problem? Is this an urgent problem? If you can think of something like the difference in urgency between climate disaster or passing a tax law, that might flavor your writing. And then this red part here is the climax. So this is the action. This is the turning point, the bam. This is the in your story, where all the magic happens. And then the falling action, which is in blue, is how the story will wind down and set up for the ultimate resolution, where the questions are finally answered. And in your resolution, you want this to be satisfying. This means any questions you set up in the exposition must be answered by the time you get to this resolution. And the reader should gain something by digesting and reading what you have written. And something to keep in mind here is that readers like to feel clever. As I said, good science writing sets up a series of questions in the reader's mind, and really good writing, to me, delays the answers through the stages of the narrative. However, that answer can't be delayed too much, only enough to let the readers guess a little bit on what's going to happen next. And this is, as I said earlier, that good writing fulfills our expectations. If a question is set up, we expect it to be answered within our narrative. So let's talk about this in the context of science writing. This is general writing tips, but specifically for science writing. If you're writing a research summary or a highlight of a particular piece of research you've done, maybe you want a local newspaper to pick up on your work, a good practice for incorporating narrative is to put the results first. This is your background, because if the results were the climax of your story, then people would simply read your paper rather than reading what you've written about your paper. Then your rising action would be the previous results and the barriers and experiments that led to the main result. And then the climax would be the one critical experiment or one idea that led to the results or discovery. And finally, the following action and conclusion would be what these results mean in the context of other work and what researchers will be doing next, inevitably influenced by the results you've told everybody about. So we have our setting, our rising action, our climax, our following action, our conclusion, and we must link them together to make one story. And one strategy to do this is to explicitly phrase those links as questions. How did this happen? What does this mean? How did we come to this? It may feel awkward when writing, but when reading it, it will feel more natural. So now that we've gone through the 5 steps, I just wanted to go quickly over a couple of what I like to call pro-writing tips. And the first of these is get to the point quickly. This is the most important rule. This is your essential info, who, what, where, and when, additional information that is helpful but not crucial, and nice to have. And this overrides every other rule that we will talk about later. So even if you may have heard that to use active voice, or in science maybe to use passive voice, getting to the point quickly matters more than which voice you use. For example, you might be able to tell from my accent, but I am American. And if I were to see a newspaper headline, or if I was to write a newspaper headline that said, "A bear mauled President Joe Biden," that would sound kind of weird, because the important part of that sentence is not a bear. The important part of that sentence would be Joe Biden. So if I'm writing this headline, I would probably switch the order of the sentence and say, President Joe Biden was mauled by a bear, getting the important, the essential info first. The second technical tip is to, when you can, use active voice. That would be the bear does the action, but like I said, we can break this rule. The second is pace. This is what really dictates your voice or your personality in writing. And a good way to create a good voice and to be clear is to write using shorter sentences. Or you can use very long and very convoluted sentences with lots of twists and turns in order to make your point, but I really advise against that because it's very difficult to kind of lose the plot if you keep your sentences too long. So shorter sentences do make your writing more accessible and you more likable as a writer. With this, you can be a little bit more provocative and fun. There was a 2020 Nature News article. So I do say that no more than 20 words per sentence. And the reason for that is because you don't want to add too many things to a single sentence. It gets all blurry and messy. So no more than 1 or 2 points. And I just want to stress that single word sentences are okay. And even in publications like mine or in the science world, there was a 2020 news article that Nature published, so not primary science, but secondary science. And the opening line of that Nature news article was a 1-word sentence. And that sentence was bollocks, with an exclamation point. So I do encourage people to take a little bit of freedom and have a little bit of creativity in how they set these things up. So to summarize our look at secondary content, we do have a 5-step program: audience, intent, length, message, narrative, a little bit about narratives and what the components of them are, and some pro tips for science writing, which can be summarized into shorter sentences, pace, using active voice when you can. And now let's talk about primary research. And as we talked about before, primary research is you writing your results, usually for other scientists. And this is mostly what I work out with in my job. So as an editor for Nature, you would write your results into a primary research manuscript. You would submit that manuscript to me, and then I'm one of the people that decide whether or not this manuscript becomes ultimately published and added to the scientific record within our journal. So primary research still follows the same 5-step program as secondary research does, or as storytelling does. And the first rule, in general, always, is think of the reader. But when writing a research paper, you only have 3 main audiences. You have the editor, which is me. You have the referees, which are also called reviewers, who will check the scientific validity of your work. And you have other sciences at varying levels of expertise, varying from undergraduates to Nobel Prize winners. And generally, I've found that each of these audiences will read a paper differently. Everybody reads your title, and those must be optimized for search engines as well, because you want people to be able to find your research paper. Editors we'll read your entire paper, but unlike scientists, we will start with the introduction and the conclusion, and then I'll work our way, at least whenever I read a paper, I work my way through to the results. And referees are mostly focused on just the results and the methods. So they are checking for validity, they are checking for scientific rigor, they're checking to make sure that your data comes to the same conclusions that you claim that it does, while other scientists, as we went over in the beginning, tend to simply read the abstract and then look at the figures. So basically, every part of your paper needs to be intentional and it needs to serve each of these audiences. So first, we'll go over general writing tips for the whole paper, and then we'll break down a scientific paper into its parts. And I think we should keep in mind that the goal of primary research is to convey your results and their implications clearly and reproducibly. A primary research paper is really your contribution to the scientific record. And to get started with this, let's talk a little bit about the editorial process. So this is a rather complicated diagram here, but you as scientists in this diagram are the author. And whenever you submit your paper to us, it then goes to the editors, and we make what we call a first decision. And this first decision is whether or not to reject the manuscript, also called a desk rejection, or to send it out for peer review. If your paper goes out for peer review, then the editors interface with the peer reviewers, we retrieve their comments, and then we decide what we call the second decision to invite a revision of the paper or to reject the paper. And sometimes these can end up in several rounds of review, and after it has been substantially revised, we can ultimately decide after peer review to accept the paper. So now that we kind of see the scientific process, let's go into number 2. The intent of writing a scientific paper usually doesn't change. It's almost always reporting results. And for this, we always say, explain, don't hype. And the reason for this is because good results will make themselves obvious. You don't need to package them into a lot of flowery language or hyperbole in order to make the other scientists and your editors and your peer reviewers, who, as we just talked about, are experts in your field, to understand if your results are revolutionary or not. Like this will be obvious in what you have done. So I always tell people to avoid selling your work with hyperbole. Instead of saying, this remarkable, novel, groundbreaking, paradigm shifting, this will only invite the peer reviewers to heavily criticize your work. And instead, be direct, be concise, make your sentences shorter. The synthesis yields a pure product, and the good result will be obvious. In the same vein, claims of novelty. We report a novel approach. We have done this for the first time. This is unprecedented. Novelty will be implicit in the context. If you've done something truly new, the experts in the field will recognize that. And you don't need to paint the picture with your language. You can just report your results as they are. 3 in my 5-step program is picking a length. For a research paper, this is usually between 4 to 10 pages for a research article. And with the journal Nature, you are limited to 4 figures. And then finally, asserting your message. This one is a little bit tricky for primary research and for scientific articles, because you want to always impart on your reader. You want your reader to come away knowing why this is important versus what you have done. For example, your reader should never come away from your research paper thinking, so what? Why did we research this? Why should anybody care? You want to make sure that that is answered throughout your paper. And some tips for doing this well is to read papers you like and find accessible. This is a good starting point, and if you can see how other people do it, you can kind of emulate this in your own writing. You want to just avoid a descriptive or chronological writing style. So rather than presenting results in the order by which you came to those results, present them in a logical fashion, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. And then you want to guide the reader through the story with a clear structure, logical flow. Again, avoid chronological order as much as possible. Make the significance clear. And then once again, just as with the secondary science writing, we want to use short sentences. Limit to 20 words where possible. This will make your writing easier to digest, and it'll be easier to find the novelty and the significance of your work if your work is not confusing. And in the vein of confusing, we want to try to avoid jargon and acronyms where we can. Some is necessary, some are widely accepted in the field, but especially whenever you're writing for a broader scientific audience, especially for one like a journal like Nature, you want people who are highly educated, who are scientists, to at least be able to understand your work. And that's very difficult to do whenever there is too much jargon and acronyms. And so for number 5, building the story structure, I did mention that in general, papers should never be written as a historical timeline of your research path, because research is messy. Sometimes we find dead ends, or we run experiments in parallel, or you have collaborators, or you move on to different wings of the project while waiting on samples. And if you write events in the order that they happened, it will likely be confusing and really long and wordy. So what you should do instead is set up a problem for your introduction and then solve it through your experiments and results. And we call this logical flow. And I just want to do a quick exercise here. So I have 3 examples of writing. And I think what we should try to do is figure out what is logical flow. So the 3 examples I have here are about baking a pear cake. One of them is narrative flow, which is very storytelling. It's intended to evoke emotion. One is logical flow, which is what we want for our science articles. And one of them is chronological flow, which is the order in which events happened. So number 1 says, I wanted to bake an apple cake. I went to the supermarket, but they were out of apples. So I bought pears and baked the cake. Pears can be a substitute for apples in a cake. Number 2 says, my supermarket has a shortage of apples, which is problematic for baking a cake. In this work, I show that pears can be a suitable substitute for baking a cake. And number 3 says, no apples, try a pear. When my supermarket was out of apples, I thought surely my baked cake would be ruined. Desperate, I used pears instead. It was delicious. So which one of those do you think is storytelling? Which one is emotional, that invokes a little bit of drama? Just write in the comments. Number 1, 2, or 3. 3, excellent, yes. And which one do you think uses logical flow, the one that we want to use in our paper? 2, excellent. You guys are fantastic. And that's exactly right. And so number 1 would be this chronological flow. And something that we can immediately see here, even with this short, kind of silly example, is that the chronological flow is quite wordy. There's more words here than in the logical flow. And it's not very clear what the problem is. Is the problem baking a cake or having no apples? Whereas by contrast, well, the logical flow presents the problem first and then solves it. And then finally, the narrative starts with the solution and then guides us through the narrative. So now that we've gone through our 5-step program, let's quickly go over your research paper in parts. So we have several parts to a research paper, and we're going to go through them one by one. So the first part is your title. We talked a little bit about this. You need to optimize it for the search engine. It should make the significance clear. And in your title, you really want to, as best you can, convey the main message of the work, but not in too much detail, because that's what your abstract is for. You absolutely want to avoid hyperbole and too many adjectives, such as novel or new. And you also want to include keywords to enhance discoverability. Some are good, but too many kind of sounds like a list of buzzwords, so choose them carefully and use them judiciously. Pick only the ones that matter. And finally, avoid uncommon abbreviations and acronyms. So this is what I'm going to get into is one of my favorite New York Times articles ever. It was a newspaper report that looked at a study done on scientific literature. And the title of this article in the New York Times says, "Are you confused by scientific jargon? Well, so are the scientists." And for those of us in the group that like graphs, on the y-axis, you have the number of citations, and on the x-axis, you have the proportion of jargon or extremely technical words in the title. And as you can see, with the more like highly technical, like jargon heavy words you have in the title of your manuscript, the less citations you get over time, because simply the hypothesis is that particularly for interdisciplinary work with too much jargon is just simply not as understandable. So people tend to work with and use results that are more accessible. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, this is also true for the abstract. And the takeaway message is that simplicity is good. So speaking of the abstract, the purpose of the abstract is to hook your reader. You know, you want to invite them into the paper, you want to summarize the results, and you want to make the question being addressed clear, summarize the most important findings, and importantly, note the implications. Why do we care about this? Why does this work matter? Why am I working on this? And the detailed methodology, or the critical methodology, you know, only if it's absolutely critical, because if it's too detailed, put that in the method section. You have no space for it in your abstract. And also, something that I like to tell people is not to specifically reference figures. If you say something like, in figure 2, we do this. If you don't publish your work open access, and if you publish it with a subscription model, then oftentimes the abstract is the only part of your paper that some scientists are going to be able to read. So I would avoid trying to specifically reference figures in the paper, because sometimes your readers won't be able to see those figures. And thankfully at Nature, we have a abstract formula that we ask all of our authors to eventually use, that we hope makes the work a little bit more accessible. So the abstract begins with a broad introduction and then moves on to specific results and then covers broad implications. This is similar to how the main text of the paper is usually structured, in like a hourglass shape. So first we start with the introduction. That is the text in pink. It provides context for the findings. This is the previous work that shows the readers why the topic is important and explains what we already know, the foundation on which your study builds, and the previous work that delineates the gap in our knowledge. No more than 2 to 3 sentences. In green, we have the gap or the problem. This is what your work is addressing, and the importance of filling this gap. This is where you can explain which features are known, which are uncertain, and why this uncertainty is a problem. The purple is something that we at Nature are very known for. We always ask our authors to include a sentence that says, "Here we show." And this is the headline conclusion of the study, 1 sentence. It contrasts with the gap in green and focuses the reader before they get on to the findings that lead to the conclusion. And then finally, in orange, we have the conclusions and the advance. So this is the short and preferably, so this is a very short focus on the most important findings that underpin the main conclusions. So how does this change our understanding? What are the immediate implications? What are the key points of interest for Nature readers and editors? And this is what you want to finish your abstract with. And here's a very quick example of this. There we go. Quick example of this in an actual, like, real Nature article that is about coastal flooding. And so we can see here that in the pink, we set up the problem. In green, or in pink, we set up the background. In green, we set up the problem. Purple, we say exactly what the study accomplishes. And then finally, in orange, we say, what are the implications of this? Why do we care? You know, why is this important? So now that we've gone through the abstract, the next part of your paper is the introduction. And the introduction sets the stage of your work. So as I mentioned many times throughout this talk, good writing fulfills our expectations. Good writing sets up a series of questions in the reader's minds. How did they do that? And then importantly, answers them. So with the introduction, you really want to set the background, moving from general to specific. You don't want to assume knowledge, especially because the introductions of papers are particularly important for undergraduates and early career researchers. And you want to be selective but scholarly with these citations. You can't cite everything, so you only want to cite the most important work that has a direct implication to your findings. And finally, you want to summarize your findings briefly and lead into the results section. My absolute favorite paragraph to ever read in an introduction says, in this paper, we, and then it expands on the one sentence that you've added to your introduction. So the results and discussion is the heart of your paper. This is where you put your results, this is where you report what you found, and as we went through before, you want to order your experiments logically, not chronologically. So you want to include essential methodological detail, but not so much that it blurs your results. You want to use headings to guide readers through the story and to guide your writing. And you want to discuss the previous relationship to works and note the limitations. And this is very important because this will contextualize and convey your results. And finally, your figures. So advice that I always give to scientists about their figures is this first sentence here. And this says that clarity is more important than beauty. And what this means is that, lots of people like to have very nice animations or a lot of colors. But if that makes your results less readable, even if your figure is not beautiful, it's better if it conveys more information. And same with the results, you want to present them in a logical order. And in the same vein of clarity, we want to keep figures focused. You don't really want to add a bunch of things to one figure. Every figure should only represent a single concept. And you can use diagrams for complex ideas or methods and the caption to explain what is in the figure. So I just want to quickly summarize what we've gone over with primary research, adding your work to the scientific literature and how this differs from secondary science. So we have the same 5-step program. We are using logical flow, not chronological flow. And then we've gone into the difference a little bit between writing an abstract and writing a research problem or research article. So let's compare the two very quick. So in primary research, what are you writing? It's a research paper, and it goes into a scientific journal, such as mine, and it makes the contribution clear, what your work adds to the scientific literature and what the significance of your work is, what is the novelty, and your audience is almost always other experts. I do have in the last row of this table here, level of pizzazz, and what pizzazz means is drama. How much emotion are you trying to invoke? And in scientific research articles, ideally none. We don't want to present emotional arguments in our research. We want to convey facts as plainly and as concisely as possible. And in secondary content, you are allowed to add a little bit of drama. You are telling your opinion. You tend to have a more narrative flow rather than a logical flow. And you can publish that anywhere. You could put it on your Twitter page. You could put it on your website or your blog. Maybe you want to write an article for the local news. Maybe you want to interface with your own university's press office. And you want to convey your audience to educated non-experts. And I just want to quickly end this talk on how to make yourself and your work more searchable, because you do put your work into journals, and we do have, especially at Nature, we do have a notable audience and mechanisms to make your results, to put your results in front of the widest audience as humanly possible. We have our own press office, we have our own arts team, we have our own Instagram pages, these sort of things, and we have our own conferences and websites to showcase and highlight your work. But as a researcher, it's also a little bit on you to connect yourself and your presence to your research. And you can do this through things like ORCID or through Google Scholar. Twitter is not as used anymore ever since it was taken over. But I always encourage people to try to use these channels, because if you want to be invited as a speaker for a conference, or if you want to be invited as a referee for Nature or any other journal, if I cannot connect your identity and your email address and your expertise in less than 3 clicks, I'm going to find somebody else instead. So I do recommend that everybody at least has a Google Scholar page and tries to take ownership of their work, especially online. And with that concludes my talk. So thank you very much for all of your attention. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Miranda. We can proceed with questions. Does anyone have a question? You can post it in chat. For now, there were no questions, but you can also unmute yourself and pose the question yourself. If not, I can start. Perhaps I would like to know, I'm not a researcher. I am dealing with we at our office, we are trying to bring the research to the society and to the companies. So we always try to present the bulk and the core of the research to the language of the wider public. But what would be the really don'ts? So you should never do in both in primary and secondary writing of research that you would think of. What is the worst thing one can do, and what is really the best thing that captures your eye?
So I think that one of the worst things that you can do is forget to answer the question of why do we care? Because for us, whenever we're in the laboratory and we're doing research, why we care about this is obvious. You know, we have federal funding in order to do this research. We care about this research. We need to finish our PhD, or we need to get the next publication out, or get our grants, or whatever. So for us, it's very obvious. And sometimes we don't think about that it's not obvious to other audiences, especially startup companies or VCs or the public. And so whenever we are communicating with especially these non-expert audiences, and even with expert audiences, we have to answer that why question as thoroughly as we can. And then the other tip that I always have is try not to overuse hyperbole. You know, this is the most novel, this is the best, this is amazing. Because usually, if it is the best, people will already know.
Okay, thank you very much. We have now several questions. The first one, any suggestive framework like Prisma and so forth?
Oh, that's a great question because I don't know what Prisma is. So, Mohammed, if you don't mind telling me what that is, and then maybe I can better answer the question. Feel free to unmute yourself if you don't mind.
Mohammed, would you like to unmute yourself?
Or type in the chat.
Yes, and in the meantime, we can go to the next question. How about content and data to make meaningful data-driven insight?
So I don't think I quite understand this question either. So whenever you say content and data, I'm assuming that whenever you say data, you mean the actual raw numbers, your spreadsheets, that sort of thing. And with content, maybe you're talking more about like scientific writing and presenting those results. Am I interpreting that question correctly?
In the meantime, Muhammad described what Prisma means: preferred reporting items for systematic review and meta-analysis.
So that is a very specific question. So I think these systematic reviews are secondary content. This is whenever you look at the literature that has been done typically in the past 5 years, and then you synthesize that and try to draw out the main conclusions of this research and maybe where the field is moving to next. And so in the context of your question of which was, where did that move to? Any suggestive framework? Every publisher has a different way of doing this. So I would first go into where you want to put your review or perspective article, and then see what the website recommends. Because, for example, at Nature, we like to think of our reviews and our perspectives as being vertical, whereas they take one concept and then they just go through the hows, the whens, the whys, the wheres, and then they arrive at a conclusion. Whereas another type of literature review would be something that's way more comprehensive, almost like a small textbook. And that's another way to do it. And another way to do a review would be something like a roadmap, where you just do an actual historical timeline and then predict where it's going next. And it just depends on your journal.
Okay, thank you. We can move to another one. Do the tips differ if you write theoretical or conceptual paper?
No, not really. Your audience will change, but the tips won't, because whenever you're writing theoretical paper, your audience is going to be more theoreticians, unless you are laying the theoretical groundwork for later experimentalists to use. But you're always going to follow the same 5-step program because you want your results to be clear, concise, and conveying the results as plainly as possible. And it doesn't matter if your results are theoretical or experimental.
The next one is about artificial intelligence. What is your view on using generative artificial intelligence in academic writing? How should researchers implement it in practice, if at all?
Okay, that is a great question, because obviously in the past year or so, the world has changed and writing has changed. And with AI and especially large language models such as ChatGPT, it is important to keep in mind that they are language models, which means that they model language. They do not know things. They simply use a predictive algorithm to generate the next word in a line of text. So if you are using generative AI models, I think a good use of them would be doing things like, if English is not your first language and you want to publish in English, pretty good at checking grammar. It is not good for generating ideas, because one of the problems with AI, and especially in science in general, is that you wouldn't be writing a scientific paper if it wasn't new, if it wasn't the first of its kind, if it wasn't completely novel. And the problem with large language models is that they are only as good as their training data. And what training data do you have on something that's conceptually new? So yeah, I would use it as like a grammar tool, but I would really avoid using it to create ideas or to explain ideas, because it just simply doesn't have the training data to explain what you want it to explain.
Thank you. The next question is, can you recommend a classification or overview of the different types of synthesis, like literature reviews, systematic reviews, scoping reviews, and the differences between them?
Yes, and this is also depending on your publisher. So at Nature, we have only really one type of review. Oh, we have two. The first is your reviews, which we are backwards facing. This is what has been done. This is what we've gotten from the last 5 years of research. And the second one is perspectives, and those are forward facing. This is what has been done, but how it's going to change the field moving forward. What should we do in the future? Where is the research going? And those are really the only two types of review-like articles that we publish. These literature reviews, systematic reviews, scoping reviews, like, we almost always publish literature reviews, and those are syntheses of, what the recent literature has done.
The next question is, what is preferred Nature's framework? Name it with some recognition or evidence. Is it clear enough? The question.
Yeah, I don't quite understand that question.
Perhaps if the author could explain it yourself or add additional comments in the chat, and we can return to it, and we can do now the next question. What criteria determine what tables, figures should appear in the article and which should not?
That's a great question, and you have a lot of freedom with that whenever you are writing your scientific paper. And the general rule of thumb that I tell people is that you only get 4 display items. So between all of your tables, all of your figures, you only get 4. And so in these 4, you have to choose only the ones that are essential for your story. Everything else can go into the supplementary information or in the methods section or in the extended data. And so for example, if you run a characterization or you run a simulation and then you just find the same thing just to confirm your results using other types of instrumentation or etc., I would probably put that in the supplementary information because it supports your results. It is not the center of your results. And that's how I would make the difference.
Thank you. And now we have the question, how do you view UX client effect to modern research?
Oh, I gotta give it to you, Mohammed. You're asking a lot of questions that I don't understand. UX client effect. Does that mean like that research is tending towards, more deliverables and less of an exploration of fundamental science, or is that something that's something else?
Yeah, audience user experience expectation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clarifying. I would say that this was for high impact research, which is what we work in at Nature. We call it high impact. That has never changed. So it's not really a question of modern research, because whenever you write an article for a journal like Nature or like Science or any of the Nature journals, do you want this to be as broad as it possibly can? And that changes the way that you write. And the expectation is that even if somebody is not an expert in your field, they can at least read your paper and understand, oh yeah, that's cool. I can understand why that was published in Nature, even if I don't understand the results.
The next question is how to decide what to put in the main text and what in the supplement if the space of the article is limited.
That's a great question, and it's something that's, again, kind of up to the author, so the scientists like you guys, because everything that is not essential, the central story, goes somewhere else. You only get 4 figures, you only get 3,200 words, and with that in mind, that logical flow and setting the intent of your research article and what information you need to answer the questions set up in your introduction. Everything else, method section or supplementary information. Only the essential part of your work goes into the paper.
And a follow-up to that question, what is the maximum reasonable length of a supplement that the reviewers can be expected to read?
Well, there isn't a limit to that. And the reason for that is because it varies so much between fields. For example, like if you do a lot of clinical research, you just tend to have more checks and regulations and etc. that also need to go into your supplementary information. Where if you work in something like phase change materials for memristors, you just don't have as much red tape to go through, and then your supplementary information tends to be shorter. So the short answer is unlimited. The long answer is just be reasonable. You're not writing a novel, and if it's not necessary for the paper, which would be in your paper, I would only use the supplementary information to add things that support your results. And if it doesn't directly support your results, maybe save that for a follow-up paper and publish it separately.
How about using buzzwords in research writings?
Oh, my biggest pet peeve on earth. So there's a difference between buzzwords and jargon. So like buzzwords are like hype, like, we really want, like, this is a hot field. I would say that if it's relevant to your paper, then you have to use it because, like, sometimes jargon becomes buzzwords. Like whenever graphene got really popular for a while, if you worked with graphene, yes, graphene was a buzzword, but it was also the topic of your paper. So you can't get rid of that if you're like putting it in your abstract. So I would say that the defining line is pretty loose, and it's usually changes very quickly of what makes a buzzword and what doesn't. But I will say that if you are trying to squeeze in as many buzzwords as you can to make your paper sound cooler, that usually doesn't work. You know, the takeaway is be honest about your results and use only the jargon that is necessary.
Next one, can you please repeat the usual word limit of an article? Does the word limit differ from the review article or primary research article?
Yes. So for a research article, you are limited to 3,200 words and 4 figures at Nature. Now, this will change with different journals. Nature Communications, for example, has unlimited space, but for my journal, Nature, 3,200 words, 4 figures, that's it. And the reason for that is because we physically print the magazine, and we can't have half the magazine be one paper. So that's why we have these limits. For a review article, you get up to 4,000 words. So reviews do tend to be longer. They also tend to have many more references. And they do get an extra 1 or 2 figures as well.
What free research tools and trainings Nature offers?
So we offer a few. So we have our we have editors like me who come and do talks like this. You know, we're very happy to schedule Meet the Editor sessions. We're very happy to do sessions on scientific training. We also have Nature Master classes, which are available online and sometimes in person, where we have an editor come over and talk about specific parts of scientific publishing. We also have some tools for our referees and for authors for finding the right journal for where their work should go. Yeah.
Okay, thank
There's
you.
a lot. We're pretty big.
We have another question. Does the editor read the comments of reviewers, and what action is taken if a reviewer makes strange or non-relevant comments?
Yes, we do read the comments of the reviewers. So whenever I put up that diagram where we showed the scientific process, the reviewers, like your paper goes out for your review, the reviewers return their comments to the editor. And then from there, the editor decides, based on their initial assessment and the comments of the referees, whether or not we want to invite a revision. So with that in mind, and that doesn't mean that reviewers decide whether or not a paper goes out for revision. That is still the editor's decision. I can overrule peer reviewers if I think the paper is really significant and worth publishing, as long as the comments of the referees are not strictly technical, because the reviewers are the experts in the field and I am more broad in my expertise, so on the specific details, etc. And the strange, non-relevant comments, it depends. So if it's completely inappropriate, we could do something such as small as explain to the authors like that these comments are weird, but we're presenting them anyway. We could remove the comments entirely, or we could ask the peer reviewer to change their report and ask them if they really mean what they put into the peer review report. And for strange, non-relevant comments, usually in your letter from the editor will say only respond to the things that are relevant. And or if they're not relevant, please explain to us why you feel that they are irrelevant.
We have another follow-up question. Does the word limit include only main text or also the references, which can add quite a lot of words and characters?
So the word limit is just for words. We have a separate limit for references. So you're allowed 3,200 words, and you are allowed up to 40 references. So no, they're not included in the word count.
Any other questions, perhaps? Apparently we have run out of questions. Perhaps, do you think there is still one last advice that you could give to our participants, or have we covered everything?
Yeah, I would say that whenever you write your work, I hope that you enjoy it. And if you enjoy what you're writing about, your writing will become better. So if you don't like what you've written, chances are other people might not understand it either. So, you know, at least try to like what you're writing. I'm sure that you're all great writers.
Okay, thank you then, Miranda, and thank you all for being with us for this last hour.
Thank you all for your time and attention.
Yes, thank you. We will send you the recording of the event so you can revisit it afterwards, and we are available for you for additional questions in the next days, for example. And Miranda, special thanks to you for granting us your time and your advice and knowledge, sharing your knowledge with us. Hope to see you soon, again, also in person.
Yes, thank you. It was a lovely experience.
Thank you. Have a nice day.